The man who invented history was a liar. That's what they called him in his own lifetime. The father of lies, and they weren't entirely wrong. Herodotus told stories about gold-guarding griffins, one-eyed warriors, and flying snakes in Arabia. He described giant ants that dug up gold dust and men whose heads grew beneath their shoulders. His critics dismissed him as a storyteller, a fantasist, someone who couldn't distinguish truth from tavern gossip. 2,500 years later, archaeologists keep proving him right. The gold dust? Real, gathered by marmots in Central Asia, exactly where he said. The giant ants? Probably Persian marmots again, mistranslated. The flying snakes? Likely gliding lizards from the Arabian Peninsula. The fantastic city of Babylon, with its hanging gardens and massive walls. All real, confirmed by excavation. Even his wildest claims keep turning out to contain kernels of truth that modern scholarship eventually validates. But here's what matters more than whether Herodotus got his facts straight. Before him, nobody wrote history. Not the way we understand it. The Egyptians kept king lists, the Mesopotamians recorded royal achievements, the Greeks told myths about their past. But Herodotus did something different. He asked why. He travelled to find out. He collected stories from ordinary people, not just kings. He tried to understand how the world worked by examining what had actually happened. He created a new way of thinking about the past, and in doing so, he created us. Every history book, every documentary, every attempt to understand where we came from traces back to a single Greek man who decided to write down what he learned by asking questions. This is the story of how that happened. Herodotus was born in Halicarnassus, a Greek city on the coast of what is now Turkey, sometime around 484 BC. The exact date is uncertain. The ancient biographers who tried to pin it down were working from fragments and educated guesses, and they contradicted each other constantly. What we know for certain is that he entered a world that was still recovering from the greatest clash of civilizations the Mediterranean had ever seen. 15 years before his birth, the Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had ever known, had invaded Greece. The Persians controlled everything from Egypt to India, from the Black Sea to the Arabian desert. They had wealth beyond imagination, armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and a king who claimed to rule by divine right. Greece was a collection of squabbling city-states that could barely agree on anything. Nobody gave them a chance, and yet Greece won. At Marathon, at Salamis, at Plataea, the Greeks defeated the Persians in a series of battles that should have been impossible. The victories were so improbable, so against every reasonable expectation, that they demanded explanation. Herodotus grew up in a world still trying to understand what had happened. The stories were everywhere. Every Greek city had its heroes, its tales of sacrifice and courage. Veterans gathered in the agora to tell their war stories. Monuments commemorated the dead. The victory over Persia had become the defining moment of Greek identity. But the stories didn't always match. Athenians told one version, Spartans told another. The Corinthians had their own account, and mixed in with genuine history were legends, exaggerations, and outright propaganda. Nobody had written it all down in a systematic way. Nobody had tried to figure out what actually happened. Halicarnassus itself was a complicated place to grow up Greek. The city was technically Greek, founded by settlers from the Peloponnese centuries earlier. It spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and considered itself part of the Greek world. But it sat on the edge of the Persian Empire, and for most of Herodotus's childhood, it was under Persian control. The local ruler, a tyrant named Ligdamis, governed as a Persian vassal. This meant Herodotus grew up between worlds. He was Greek by culture, but Persian by political reality. He would have seen Persian officials in the streets, heard Persian spoken alongside Greek, observed Persian customs mixing with Greek traditions. His hometown was a crossroads, a place where East met West, and this shaped everything about how he would later see the world. The ruling family of Halicarnassus was connected to his own. Ancient sources tell us that Herodotus was related to Parnassus, an epic poet who was famous in his day, and apparently quite good, though almost none of his work survives. This connection to the literary world mattered. It meant Herodotus grew up in a household where poetry was valued, where stories were told well, where the craft of narrative was understood and practiced. It also meant he grew up in a household that was politically dangerous. Sometime in the 460s BC, when Herodotus was probably in his late teens or early 20s, things went wrong. The ancient sources are frustratingly vague about the details, but the outline is clear enough. There was a political upheaval in Halicarnassus. Parnassus, the famous poet, was executed by the tyrant Lygdamis, and Herodotus had to leave. Whether he fled or was exiled, we don't know. What we know is that he ended up on the island of Samos, just offshore from Halicarnassus, but safely outside Lygdamis's reach. He was a refugee, a young man without a city, cut off from his home and his family's position. This exile, this forced departure from everything familiar, might have been the making of him. On Samos, Herodotus had time to think, time to study, time to develop the questions that would drive his life's work. The island had an excellent library. It was a centre of learning, home to philosophers and poets, and it was a place where information from across the Mediterranean world flowed through constantly. Ships arrived from Egypt, from Phoenicia, from the Black Sea colonies, from Sicily and southern Italy. Every harbour brought news, stories, accounts of distant places. Herodotus started collecting them. We don't know exactly when he began the project that would become the Histories. There was no moment where he sat down and decided to write the first history book. Instead, there seems to have been a gradual accumulation. He heard a story about Egypt and wanted to know more. Someone told him about the Scythians north of the Black Sea and their strange customs. A merchant described the wealth of Babylon. A veteran recounted the Battle of Marathon. The questions multiplied. Why did the Persians invade Greece? How did the war start? What were the Persians like as people? How did their empire work? What about the Egyptians, who the Persians had conquered? What about the Lydians and the Babylonians and all the other peoples who'd been swept up in the great clash between East and West? To answer these questions, Herodotus would have to travel. And travel in the ancient world was not what it is now. There were no hotels, no restaurants, no tourist infrastructure. Roads were dangerous, full of bandits. Sea voyages were risky, dependent on weather and season. Communication was slow and unreliable. Simply getting from one place to another could take weeks or months, and that's assuming you survived the journey. Herodotus went anyway. At some point in his 20s or 30s, he began the travels that would define his life. He went to Egypt and sailed up the Nile as far as Elephantine, the southern frontier of the Egyptian world. He travelled to Babylon and saw the ruins of the great ziggurat. He visited the Greek cities along the Black Sea coast and learned about the Scythians who lived beyond. He toured the battlefields of Greece, where the Persians had been defeated. He went to Cyrene in North Africa, to Tyre in Phoenicia, to the Oracle at Delphi. Everywhere he went, he asked questions. How did you build this? Why do you do things this way? What do you remember about the war? What stories do your grandparents tell? Can you explain this custom? Where does this river come from? He talked to priests in Egyptian temples and learned about their ancient kings. He spoke with Persian officials and heard their version of events. He interviewed Greek veterans and recorded their memories of the battles. He collected local legends, foreign customs, strange practices, architectural details, geographic observations, anything that might help him understand the world he was trying to describe. And slowly, over years of travel and inquiry, a massive project took shape. What began as questions about the Persian Wars expanded into something much larger. To understand why Persia invaded Greece, you had to understand how Persia became an empire. To understand that, you had to know about the kingdoms Persia conquered. To understand those kingdoms, you had to go back further, into their origins and their own histories. The project kept growing, reaching backward in time and outward in space until it encompassed the entire known world. But Herodotus was doing something that had never been done before, and he was making it up as he went along. There were no rules for writing history, because history as a genre didn't exist. There were no models to follow, no established methods, no conventions about what should be included or how it should be presented. So he borrowed from everywhere. From epic poetry, he took the narrative drive, the character development, the dramatic scenes. From tragedy, he borrowed the sense of fate and irony, the way great men rise and fall. From the Ionian philosophers, he took the spirit of inquiry, the habit of asking why. From the oral tradition of storytelling, he took the episodic structure, the memorable anecdotes, the vivid details that make a story stick. He mixed it all together and created something new, a prose narrative that tried to explain the world through the systematic collection and critical evaluation of evidence. That's history. That's what he invented. But invention is messy, and the man who created history was still figuring out how to do it. He included everything he heard, even the stories he doubted. He recorded contradictory accounts and let readers judge. He got things wrong, misunderstood customs, accepted false information. He trusted some sources he shouldn't have, and doubted some he should have believed. His critics in Athens, where he eventually settled, mocked him. They called him credulous, naive, a collector of tall tales. The philosopher Aristotle would later dismiss parts of his work as mythodes, filled with myths. Other writers accused him of bias, of favouring Athens over Sparta, or vice versa, depending on which writer you read. But buried in the criticism was something else. Recognition that Herodotus had created something unprecedented. Even his harshest critics were responding to him, engaging with his work, treating it as important enough to attack. Within a generation of his death, writers were imitating his method, building on his foundation, trying to write history themselves. The genre he invented had taken root, yet the man himself remains elusive. We can reconstruct his travels, analyse his text, trace his sources, but Herodotus, as a person, as an individual, with hopes and fears and private thoughts, stays just out of reach. He rarely appears in his own narrative. When he does, it's usually to say, "I saw this myself," or "I heard this story but don't believe it." The voice is present, but the man behind it is hidden. What drove him to spend years travelling the Mediterranean, collecting stories, building this enormous work? Was it curiosity alone, or was there something else? Did the exile from Halicarnassus leave him searching for a home in the only way he could, by making the entire Greek world his subject? Did watching his relative Panyasis die for political reasons make him determined to record truth before it could be silenced? We can only guess. What we know for certain is that sometime around 430 BC, Herodotus completed his great work and began presenting it publicly. The readings happened at festivals, at public gatherings, wherever crowds assembled. Picture it. A man standing before hundreds of Greeks, scrolling through a papyrus roll, reciting stories of wars and wonders. Hours of performance, sometimes spread over days. The audience wasn't reading silently in private rooms. They were experiencing history as a communal event, the way they experienced theatre or religious ceremonies. Athens became his base, the city at the height of its power, where democracy flourished and intellectual life thrived. Pericles ruled, the Parthenon rose on the Acropolis, and philosophers like Socrates walked the Agora, asking uncomfortable questions. It was the centre of everything that mattered in the Greek world, and Herodotus was there for it. He became friends with Sophocles, the great playwright. We know this because Sophocles wrote a poem praising him. He moved in circles that included the leading thinkers and artists of the age. His work was known, discussed, debated. Some Athenians loved it. Others thought it gave too much credit to Athens' rivals. But Athens wasn't entirely comfortable for him either. He was still an outsider, still a foreigner. The Athenians had a word for people like him: metic, resident alien, someone who lived in the city but could never be a full citizen. He couldn't own land, couldn't vote in the assembly, couldn't hold political office. No matter how celebrated his work became, he remained apart. Then in 444 BC, Athens founded a new colony called Thurii in southern Italy. It was a pan-Hellenic project meant to include Greeks from multiple city-states, not just Athenians. The organisers needed colonists, people willing to start fresh in a new place. Herodotus, now in his 40s, decided to go. Why would a man, at the height of his fame, leave the cultural centre of Greece for a frontier settlement? Maybe Thurii offered what Athens never could: full citizenship, a fresh start, a place where his foreign birth didn't matter. Or maybe he simply wanted to keep travelling, keep seeing new places. The wanderer in him wasn't done yet. He lived the rest of his life in Thurii. How many years exactly, we don't know. Some ancient sources say he died there. Others claim he returned to Athens before the end. The record goes quiet. Somewhere in the 420s BC, probably around 425, Herodotus died. No dramatic death scene, no final words recorded. He simply exits the historical stage as quietly as he entered it. But the work survived. Copies spread across the Greek world. Within a generation, his Histories was recognized as essential. Later scholars in Alexandria divided it into 9 books, naming each after one of the muses. That's how we know it today. 9 books covering the rise of Persia, the Ionian Revolt, and the Persian Wars. Nearly 500,000 words of investigation into why things happened the way they did. Book 1 opens with a statement of purpose that still resonates. This is the publication of the research of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, so that the deeds of men may not be forgotten in time, and that great and marvellous works, some performed by Greeks, some by barbarians, may not lose their glory, and especially the reason why they fought one another. The reason why. That's the heart of it. Not just what happened, but why it happened. That question drives everything he wrote. When he describes Croesus's fall, he's asking why powerful kings make catastrophic mistakes. When he traces the growth of the Persian Empire, he's asking how a small kingdom became a superpower. When he analyzes the Greek victory at Marathon, he's asking how a smaller force defeated a massive invasion. He had a theory about power. It corrupts, it makes men arrogant, it leads them to overreach. He saw it everywhere in his research. Croesus conquered too much and fell. Cyrus pushed too far east and died in battle. Cambyses went mad with absolute power. Darius tried to conquer Greece and failed. Xerxes repeated his father's mistake on an even grander scale and failed worse. The Greeks called it hubris, excessive pride that brings divine punishment. But Herodotus wasn't quite making a religious argument. He was observing a pattern. Power creates illusions. It makes rulers believe they're invincible, that normal limits don't apply to them. And that belief leads to decisions that destroy them. It's psychology as much as theology. He also believed in the power of freedom. The Persians were subjects of a king. They fought because they were ordered to. The Greeks, especially the Athenians, fought as free citizens defending their own land. That made them more dangerous. Herodotus saw political systems as variables that affected outcomes. Democracy produced better soldiers than tyranny. Not because Greeks were inherently superior, but because free men fight harder than slaves. This was radical thinking. Most Greeks of his era believed they were simply better than barbarians, superior people destined to dominate inferior ones. Herodotus rejected that. He travelled too much to believe it. He'd seen Persian courage, Egyptian wisdom. Babylonian sophistication. He knew the world was more complicated than Greek chauvinism allowed, but he was still Greek. His bias shows. He treats Greek religion more seriously than Persian religion. He assumes Greek customs are normal and others are exotic. He sometimes describes foreign practices with barely concealed disgust. The man who invented cultural relativism couldn't fully escape his own culture. His treatment of women reveals the contradictions. He includes far more women in his narrative than most ancient historians. Queens who influence policy, priestesses who deliver prophecies, ordinary women whose actions matter. He records their stories when other writers ignored them entirely. Yet he also repeats misogynistic assumptions, treats women's political power as somehow unnatural, and rarely questions the patriarchal structure of Greek society. He's trying to be fair, trying to see the world clearly. But he's human. He has blind spots. The miracle isn't that he transcended his era completely. It's that he managed to transcend it at all. Consider his handling of religion. The gods are everywhere in his histories. They send dreams, deliver oracles, punish hubris, intervene in battles. Is Herodotus a believer reporting divine action, or a skeptic recording what people believed? Scholars still debate this. Some passages suggest genuine piety, others hint at doubt. He visits the oracle at Delphi, that sacred shrine where the priestess of Apollo delivered prophecies that shaped Greek politics. He records dozens of oracles, analyzes their accuracy, notes when they were misinterpreted. He seems to believe something real happens at Delphi. But he also observes that oracles are often ambiguous, that people hear what they want to hear, that political interests shape religious interpretation. When describing foreign religions, he's even more ambiguous. He identifies Egyptian gods with Greek gods, assuming they're the same beings under different names. He describes Persian fire worship without mockery. He records Babylonian sacred prostitution with the detached tone of an anthropologist. Is he saying all religions worship the same truth differently? Or is he just being polite about practices he privately thinks are nonsense? We can't know. He won't tell us. Maybe he didn't know himself. Faith is complicated. Doubt coexists with belief. A man can participate in religious rituals while questioning their literal truth. Herodotus lived in that ambiguous space, and he left it ambiguous in his text. What's certain is his commitment to evidence. When he can verify something himself, he says so. I saw this with my own eyes. When he can't, he reports multiple versions and lets readers judge. Some say this happened, others say that. I cannot determine which is true. It's a historian's method, the beginning of source criticism, the recognition that not all testimony is equally reliable. But he also includes stories he admits are impossible. Phoenix that rise from ashes, gold guarding griffins, Amazons who cut off their right breasts. Why? Partly because his audience expected marvels. Partly because he's genuinely curious about folklore and myth. Partly because he hasn't yet drawn a firm line between history and legend. That line would come later. His successor, Thucydides, would write about the Peloponnesian War with deliberate rejection of the marvellous, insisting on strict verification, excluding anything that couldn't be proven. Thucydides saw himself as correcting Herodotus's mistakes, creating a more rigorous form of history. But something was lost in that correction. Thucydides's history is brilliant, analytical, profound. It's also narrower. He writes only about war and politics. He ignores culture, religion, everyday life. He strips away the texture that makes Herodotus so rich. In gaining rigour, history lost breadth. The ancient world split on Herodotus. Some loved him. Cicero called him the father of history. Lucian praised his prose style. Others attacked him. Plutarch wrote an entire essay titled On the Malice of Herodotus, accusing him of bias and dishonesty. Ctesias tried to discredit his account of Persia. Josephus questioned his accuracy. The attacks reveal something important. Herodotus mattered enough to attack. If his work had been trivial or ignored, nobody would have bothered refuting it. The very vehemence of the criticism proves his influence. That influence stretched across centuries. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia, he carried a copy of Herodotus's Histories with him. He retraced routes Herodotus described. He visited sites Herodotus had written about. The book became a guidebook for conquest. Roman historians read him. Livy borrowed his methods. Strabo the geographer used him as a source. Medieval scholars knew him only in fragments, but those fragments influenced how Europeans understood the ancient world. When Byzantine scholars fled to Italy during the fall of Constantinople, they brought Greek manuscripts, including complete texts of Herodotus. The Renaissance rediscovered him. Translations appeared, first into Latin, then into modern languages: English, French, German, Italian. Each generation found something new in him. The Enlightenment praised his rationalism. The Romantics loved his storytelling. The 19th century used him to understand Oriental despotism. The 20th century analysed his narrative techniques. Modern archaeology vindicated him repeatedly. Scholars who dismissed his descriptions of Babylon as fantasy were proven wrong when excavations uncovered the city matching his account. His description of Scythian burial customs, long doubted, was confirmed when frozen tombs in Siberia revealed exactly what he described. His account of Persian royal roads was verified by archaeological surveys. He wasn't always right. He got chronology wrong sometimes. He misunderstood some customs. He passed on false information. But he was right far more often than his critics expected. The traveller really had travelled. The investigator really had investigated. Modern historians still argue about him. Some defend him as remarkably accurate given his limitations. Others insist he's more storyteller than historian, that his work belongs to literature rather than history. Both sides claim him because he genuinely belongs to both traditions. He created a hybrid form, part investigation, part entertainment, part evidence-based analysis, part dramatic narrative. Future historians would split these elements apart, choosing either rigour or readability. Herodotus refused to choose. He wanted both, and he achieved both. And that's why his work survives when more careful but less engaging histories have vanished. Consider what he accomplished. He travelled thousands of miles in an age when travel was dangerous and slow. He learned enough of foreign languages to conduct interviews. He collected information from dozens of cultures. He organised it into a coherent narrative. He asked critical questions about causation and evidence. And he did it all without institutional support, without research grants, without universities or libraries, or any of the infrastructure we associate with serious scholarship. He did it alone, driven by curiosity and the conviction that the past mattered, that what happened to previous generations held lessons for the present, that understanding why events unfolded as they did could help people make better decisions in the future. Was he right about that? Does history actually teach lessons? Or do we just find in the past whatever we're looking for? Herodotus himself might have enjoyed that question. He loved ambiguity, loved showing how the same events could be interpreted multiple ways, loved demonstrating that truth was complicated, but he believed the effort was worthwhile. That trying to understand was better than not trying. That investigation was valuable even when it couldn't reach certainty. That stories deserved to be preserved even when they couldn't be fully verified. That belief created history. Not perfect history, not final history, but history as an ongoing project. An attempt to make sense of the human past using whatever tools are available. The work continues. Every historian since has been continuing what Herodotus started. Some do it better, with more sophisticated methods and better sources, but they're all building on his foundation, following the path he first walked. And now, 25 centuries later, his work still speaks. The book you can read today descends from a manuscript tradition spanning 2,000 years. Every copy before the printing press was made by hand. Monk hunched over parchment in cold scriptoria, stylus scratching through winter afternoons. Each copying introduced errors. Words misread, lines skipped, marginal notes accidentally incorporated into the main text. The miracle is not that mistakes happened, but that so much survived intact. The oldest complete manuscript dates to the 10th century, 1,000 years after Herodotus died. Fragments exist from earlier periods, papyrus scraps from Egypt, quotations in other authors' works, references that confirm people were reading him continuously. But the full text we have today passed through medieval monasteries where monks who barely understood Greek preserved words they couldn't comprehend because someone had decided this pagan historian was worth saving. Why did they save him? Partly because early Christians found him useful. He described the ancient world that provided context for biblical events. He mentioned Egypt and Persia, lands where biblical stories unfolded. His account of Xerxes' invasion could be read as demonstrating God's providence, how overweening pride leads to downfall. The theological interpretations were stretched, but they kept the manuscripts circulating. The Renaissance changed everything. Scholars recovering classical learning suddenly had better Greek, could read Herodotus as he was meant to be read. Lorenzo Valla produced a Latin translation in 1450s that made him accessible to European intellectuals who didn't know Greek. The printing press arrived just in time. The first printed edition appeared in 1502 in Venice, freezing the text in a form that could be replicated endlessly. But which text? Manuscripts disagreed with each other in thousands of places. Small variations mostly, but sometimes entire passages appeared in some copies and not others. How do you decide which version is correct when your sources are separated by centuries and contradict each other? This became the science of textual criticism. Scholars developed methods for comparing manuscripts, building family trees of texts, determining which readings were likely original and which were later corruptions. It's detective work combined with linguistic analysis, trying to think like an ancient copyist while also understanding Greek grammar well enough to spot what sounds right. Modern critical editions of Herodotus represent centuries of this work. The text you read today includes footnotes explaining where manuscripts disagree, where editors have made choices between variant readings, where the Greek is simply unclear and multiple interpretations are possible. Reading a scholarly edition means reading an entire conversation about the text, not just the text itself. Translation adds another layer of interpretation. Greek and English don't map onto each other neatly. Words carry connotations that don't transfer. Herodotus writes in an Ionic dialect that was already old-fashioned when he used it, giving his prose a slightly archaic flavour that's nearly impossible to capture in English. Do you translate him into modern colloquial English, making him accessible but losing the historical distance? Or do you use formal, elevated language that preserves the sense of antiquity but might put off modern readers? Different translators have made different choices. The Victorian translations are ornate and dignified, treating Herodotus like scripture. Mid-20th century versions aimed for clarity and directness, stripping away ornamentation. Recent translations try to preserve his storytelling voice, his digressions and conversational asides, the personality that comes through the prose. None gets him exactly right because exact rightness is impossible. Something always gets lost in translation, but the attempt matters. Each generation needs to translate him anew because language evolves, because what sounded natural 50 years ago sounds dated now, because each era brings new questions to old texts. The Histories has been translated into every major language. Arabic readers discovered him through medieval translations that emphasized his geographical knowledge. Chinese translators in the 20th century presented him as an early example of historical materialism. Russian scholars during the Soviet period analysed his treatment of class conflict. Everyone finds something different because the text is rich enough to support multiple readings. But underneath all the interpretation, something persists. The voice, the presence of a mind at work, curious and skeptical, and endlessly fascinated by the variety of human experience. You can feel it even in translation, even through layers of scholarly apparatus. Herodotus is still there, still investigating, still telling stories. Modern historians use him carefully. They check his facts against other sources when possible. They note where archaeology contradicts him, where he clearly got things wrong, where he passed on information without sufficient verification. No, but they keep using him because for many events, many places, he's the only source we have. Without Herodotus, entire chapters of ancient history would be blank pages. The Persian Wars themselves would be mysterious without him. We have Persian sources, archaeological evidence, references in later Greek writers. But the connected narrative, the explanation of how and why the wars happened, comes almost entirely from Herodotus. Remove his account, and we'd know the wars occurred but not understand them. His ethnographic descriptions are even more valuable. Without him, we'd know almost nothing about Scythian culture, about the customs of Thracian tribes, about Egyptian religious practices in the 5th century BC. Other sources exist, but they're fragmentary, technical, incomplete. Herodotus gives us the lived texture of these cultures, what it felt like to be there, how people actually behaved. Scholars debate his reliability endlessly. Some passages seem clearly based on autopsy, direct observation that matches archaeological findings perfectly. Other sections feel like hearsay, stories he heard and repeated without sufficient checking. The question is always which is which, how to separate the reliable from the questionable. One approach is to check him against material evidence. When his description of a place matches what archaeologists find, that builds confidence. When he describes Egyptian pyramid construction and the details align with engineering analysis, we trust that section more. But absence of confirmation doesn't mean he's wrong. Maybe we just haven't found the evidence yet. Another approach examines his sources. When he tells us where he got information, we can sometimes verify whether that source would have been reliable. His Egyptian material comes partly from priests at Memphis who would have had access to temple records. That's credible. His stories about distant Scythian tribes come from Black Sea colonists who traded with the Scythians. Also credible, though more prone to misunderstanding. But sometimes his sources are obviously problematic and he knows it. He reports contradictory versions of the same event, explicitly saying different people tell it differently. He includes stories he doubts, making clear he's skeptical, but preserving the account anyway. This transparency is unusual and valuable. Most ancient historians simply presented their version as fact. Herodotus shows his work. The result is a text that requires active reading. You can't just passively absorb what he says. You have to think about it, weigh it, consider whether this particular passage sounds reliable or questionable. He's training you to be critical, to investigate alongside him. That's probably his greatest legacy, not the specific facts he preserved, though those matter. Not the narrative of the Persian Wars, though that's irreplaceable. His real achievement was showing that investigating the past was possible and worthwhile. That you could ask questions, gather evidence, weigh testimony, and arrive at reasonable conclusions, even about events you didn't witness. Before Herodotus, the past was myth and legend, stories passed down that nobody questioned. After him, it was something you could investigate. The method wasn't perfect, the conclusions weren't always right, but the principle was established. History became an intellectual discipline, a field of knowledge with its own standards and methods. Every historian since has refined those methods, Thucydides made them more rigorous, stripping away the storytelling to focus on political and military analysis. Later historians developed even stricter standards, demanding multiple sources, treating testimony with more skepticism, separating reliable evidence from speculation. But something was lost in that process: the humanity, the sense of wonder, the recognition that history is about people, not just political structures and military campaigns. Herodotus never forgot that real humans made the decisions he was analysing, that those humans had motivations and emotions and cultural backgrounds that shaped what they did. Modern historians are recovering that insight. After centuries of focusing narrowly on political and military history, the field has broadened. Social history, cultural history, the history of everyday life, all these represent a return to Herodotian concerns. Interest in how ordinary people lived, what they believed, how different cultures organised themselves. This isn't coincidence. As history has matured as a discipline, it circled back to questions Herodotus asked, not abandoning the rigorous methods developed since, but combining them with his broader curiosity. The best contemporary historians are doing what he did, investigating the full range of human experience while maintaining critical standards of evidence. His influence extends beyond professional historians. Travel writers still cite him as the founder of their genre. Journalists investigating foreign cultures are doing Herodotian ethnography, whether they know it or not. Anyone trying to understand cultural difference by actually going somewhere and asking questions is following his example. The specific form he created, the extended prose investigation organised around a central question, remains vital. Modern non-fiction books on history, science, culture follow the template he established. Start with a question, pursue it through research and investigation, organise the findings into a readable narrative. That's the Herodotian method. You can see his shadow in unexpected places. Detective novels owe something to his investigative approach. Long-form journalism that digs deep into a story shares his commitment to thorough research combined with compelling narrative. Even documentary films that explore historical events are presenting Herodotian investigations in visual form. The core insight remains powerful, that understanding the past requires both rigour and imagination. You need evidence, sources, critical analysis, but you also need the ability to reconstruct how things felt, what people were thinking, why events unfolded as they did. Herodotus balanced these demands better than almost anyone since. Critics who say he's too credulous miss the point. He wasn't trying to write a modern peer-reviewed journal article. He was creating a new form, figuring out how to investigate and present the past in a way that would engage readers while maintaining reasonable standards of evidence. Given that nobody had done it before, his achievement is astonishing. The fact that we're still reading him proves he succeeded. Not just scholars studying him professionally, but general readers picking up the histories out of curiosity. The book remains in print in multiple translations, still finds new audiences, still sparks arguments about what really happened and what it means. Part of the appeal is simply good storytelling. He knows how to build suspense, how to reveal information at the right moment, how to create vivid scenes that stick in memory. The Battle of Thermopylae, Croesus on the pyre, Xerxes weeping at the sight of his army. These scenes have lasted 25 centuries because they're brilliantly told. But there's more than craft, there's wisdom. Herodotus understood something fundamental about human nature and human history. That pride leads to disaster. That cultural difference is real but not insurmountable. That understanding the past requires empathy as well as analysis. That simple explanations are usually wrong. These insights emerge gradually through the text. He doesn't announce them directly, doesn't pause to deliver lectures about his philosophy of history. You absorb them through the accumulation of examples, through seeing pattern after pattern play out across different cultures and time periods. The method is subtle but effective. By the time you finish the Histories, you've been educated in a particular way of thinking about the past. Critical but not cynical, curious but not naive, open to surprising explanations but demanding evidence. It's a mode of thought that transfers beyond ancient history, becomes a general approach to understanding the world. That might be the ultimate measure of his influence. Not that he's still read, though that matters. Not that scholars still cite him, though that's significant. But that his way of thinking, his investigative method, his combination of skepticism and openness has become foundational to how we approach knowledge itself. The man who never left home had conquered the world, not through armies or wealth, but through the sheer force of disciplined thought. When Kant died in 1804, philosophy split into two camps, those who built on his foundation and those who tried to tear it down. Both groups proved his importance. You don't spend centuries arguing with someone who doesn't matter. The German idealists came first. Fichte, Schelling, Hegel. They took Kant's system and pushed it further than he ever intended. Where Kant had been careful, cautious, always marking the boundaries of what reason could know, they were bold, reckless even. Fichte looked at the thing in itself and decided it was unnecessary baggage. If we can never know it, why assume it exists? He proposed that consciousness creates reality through its own activity, not discovers it, creates it. The self posits itself and the world along with it. Pure idealism, no remainder. Kant would have hated this. The whole point of his system was to explain how we can have genuine knowledge of an external world. Fichte had turned philosophy back into the kind of speculative fantasy that Kant spent his career dismantling. Schelling went a different direction. He wanted to reunite what Kant had separated: subject and object, mind and nature, freedom and necessity. He developed an elaborate philosophy of nature where the material world wasn't dead matter, but the visible expression of spirit. Art became the highest form of knowledge because only art could capture this underlying unity. Again, Kant would have objected, but Schelling's vision captured the imagination of the Romantic generation. Poets and artists loved the idea that nature was alive, that the creative imagination had access to truths that science couldn't reach. Then came Hegel. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel took everything Kant had said about the limits of reason and announced that reason has no limits. Reality itself is rational. History is the progressive unfolding of spirit, and absolute knowledge is possible. The whole cosmos is thought thinking itself. It was magnificent. It was absurd. It was exactly what Kant had warned against, but it dominated German philosophy for decades. Hegel's influence spread across Europe, shaped Marx, influenced generations of thinkers who either embraced or rejected his grandiose system. All of them were responding to Kant, even when they disagreed violently, even when they claimed to have moved beyond him. They were working within the framework he established. The questions he posed, the distinctions he drew, the problems he identified, these became the terrain where philosophy happened. Meanwhile, a different response was developing. The empiricist tradition, which Kant had tried to synthesize with rationalism, reasserted itself with new vigour. John Stuart Mill in England developed a thoroughgoing empiricism that rejected Kant's synthetic a priori judgments. All knowledge comes from experience, period. Mathematics is just highly confirmed generalizations. Logic is psychology. The categories aren't built into the mind, they're learned. Kant's ghost haunted this debate too. Mill was essentially trying to return to Hume, but he had to contend with Kant's objections. The arguments became more sophisticated because Kant had raised the bar. In the late 19th century, a movement arose with a simple slogan: back to Kant. The neo-Kantians were reacting against what they saw as the excesses of German idealism. Hegel had claimed too much. Schelling was too mystical. Time to return to the critical philosophy, to Kant's careful delineation of what reason can and cannot know. This movement split into schools. The Marburg School focused on science and mathematics. How do the categories enable scientific knowledge? The Southwest German School focused on history and culture. How do we understand human meaning and value? Both claimed Kant as their ancestor. Both were trying to apply his methods to new problems. The critical spirit lived on even as the specific doctrines evolved. But not everyone revered Kant. Friedrich Nietzsche despised him, called him a catastrophic spider, accused him of being a closet Christian who used philosophy to smuggle theological prejudices back into supposedly secular thought. The categorical imperative, just the Christian moral law dressed up in fancy terminology. The thing in itself, a placeholder for God. Nietzsche's attack was vicious and deeply unfair, but it revealed something true. Kant's philosophy does preserve certain Christian moral intuitions even as it claims to ground them in reason alone. The emphasis on duty, self-sacrifice, treating others as ends. These are recognizably Christian values secularized. Whether that's a bug or a feature depends on your perspective. Kant thought he was rescuing morality from the collapse of religious authority. Nietzsche thought he was perpetuating slave morality under a new guise. The 20th century brought new challenges. Logical positivists tried to eliminate metaphysics entirely. Meaning equals verification. If a statement can't be empirically tested, it's literally meaningless. Kant's thing in itself? Meaningless. His transcendental arguments? Confused nonsense. This movement failed on its own terms. The verification principle itself can't be verified, but it showed how Kant's influence extended even to his enemies. The positivists were trying to finish what Kant started, to clear away metaphysical speculation once and for all. They just thought Kant hadn't gone far enough. Existentialists took a different lesson from Kant. Sartre, Heidegger, Jaspers, they focused on freedom, on the human condition, on the burden of creating meaning in an indifferent universe. These themes have Kantian roots. Autonomy, the ability to give law to oneself, is central to Kant's moral philosophy. The existentialists radicalized it, but they also rejected Kant's rationalism. For Sartre, existence precedes essence. We're not defined by rational categories or moral laws. We create ourselves through choice. It's a kind of hyper-Kantianism that Kant himself would never recognize. Analytic philosophy, which came to dominate the English-speaking world, engaged with Kant constantly. Strawson's book on Kant, Bennett's analysis of the Critique, Allison's transcendental idealism. These are major works of 20th century philosophy that take Kant as their subject. The debates got technical. What exactly is transcendental idealism? Is it a metaphysical thesis or merely a methodological stance? Can Kant's arguments be reconstructed in modern logical terms? What's the relationship between the first and second editions of the Critique? These might seem like academic quibbles, but they matter because Kant matters. Getting him right means understanding the foundations of modern philosophy. Continental philosophy, meanwhile, developed in a different direction. Phenomenology, hermeneutics, post-structuralism. These movements often positioned themselves against Kant, but they couldn't escape him either. Husserl's phenomenology begins with Kantian questions about how consciousness constitutes as objects. Heidegger's Being and Time is partly a radicalization of Kant's analysis of time. Derrida's deconstruction targets the binary oppositions that structure Kantian thought. Even in rejection, Kant remains the reference point. You define yourself in relation to him whether you accept or refuse his framework. His moral philosophy proved especially durable. In 1971, John Rawls published A Theory of Justice, the most influential work of political philosophy in the 20th century. Rawls explicitly drew on Kant. The original position, where rational agents choose principles of justice behind a veil of ignorance, is a Kantian device. The idea that persons are ends in themselves, that rights trump utility, that justice is fairness. All of this has Kantian DNA. Rules sparked a revival of Kantian ethics. Philosophers like Christine Korsgaard, Honora O'Neill, Barbara Herman developed sophisticated neo-Kantian moral theories. They showed that Kant's ethics isn't just a historical curiosity, but a living tradition capable of addressing contemporary problems. The alternative tradition, utilitarianism, which says that right actions maximize happiness or welfare, has always been Kant's great rival. The debate between Kantian deontology and utilitarian consequentialism structures modern ethics. Every intro philosophy class teaches this divide. It's become the fundamental fault line in moral theory. Real-world applications followed: medical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics. All these applied fields have Kantian and utilitarian wings, arguing about the right approach. When doctors debate informed consent, they're implicitly invoking Kant's principle of treating persons as autonomous ends. When economists do cost-benefit analysis, they're applying utilitarian logic. The tension is productive. Neither side has won decisively. We need both perspectives. Sometimes consequences matter most. Sometimes principles can't be compromised. Kant's voice remains essential to the conversation. His influence on law is harder to see, but equally profound. The concept of human dignity that underlies modern human rights law is Kantian. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights announces that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity. That's not a scientific claim. It's a moral commitment grounded in the idea that rational agency deserves respect. Constitutional democracies embody Kantian principles: rule of law, separation of powers, protection of individual rights against majority tyranny. Kant didn't invent these ideas, but his political philosophy provided their most rigorous defense. His essay, Toward Perpetual Peace, outlined conditions for lasting international peace: a federation of free states, republican government, cosmopolitan right. These ideas influenced the League of Nations, the United Nations, the European Union. The project of building international institutions to prevent war is recognizably Kantian. Critics point out that these institutions haven't prevented war. True enough, but the vision remains powerful. The idea that peace requires more than balance of power, that it needs shared legal frameworks and mutual respect, that cosmopolitan identity can coexist with national loyalty. This is Kant's legacy in international relations. Science too bears his mark. The distinction between what we can observe and what exists independently shapes how scientists think about their theories. Instrumentalism, the view that scientific theories are tools for prediction rather than literal descriptions of reality, has Kantian undertones. We organize phenomena according to our categories. The thing in itself remains unknown. Quantum mechanics raised these issues in a new form. Does the observer affect what's observed? Is reality fundamentally indeterminate until measured? These questions echo Kant's insight that we contribute structure to our experience. Niels Bohr, one of quantum theory's founders, explicitly referenced Kant when discussing these interpretive issues. Cognitive science discovered Kant from a different angle. The mind actively constructs experience rather than passively receiving it. Perception is inference. We impose categories on sensory input. These are empirical findings that confirm Kant's philosophical speculation. Neuroscience can now map brain regions involved in different cognitive functions. We can see the neural correlates of the categories that Kant described philosophically. Space, time, causation. These aren't just abstract concepts, but reflect how our brains are wired. This doesn't prove Kant right in every detail, but it vindicates the basic insight that the mind shapes experience, that what we know is always conditioned by our cognitive apparatus, that pure objectivity, perception, without any contribution from the subject, is impossible. Artificial intelligence brings new Kantian questions. Can machines have genuine understanding, or just process information? Is consciousness necessary for rationality? Would an artificial general intelligence be bound by the moral law? These debates replay Kantian themes in technological contexts. His influence on education deserves mention. The liberal arts tradition, the idea that education should develop rational autonomy rather than merely transmit information, has Kantian roots. Critical thinking, teaching students to question assumptions, to evaluate arguments, to think for themselves. That's applied Kantianism. The university system that spread across the world in the 19th and 20th centuries embodied Enlightenment values that Kant articulated: knowledge for its own sake, freedom of inquiry, the life of the mind as a worthy pursuit regardless of practical utility. These ideals are under pressure now. Universities increasingly justify themselves through economic impact. Education becomes job training. Research must demonstrate immediate applications. Kant would have resisted this instrumental approach. Some things matter beyond their usefulness. Cultural impact is harder to quantify, but no less real. The emphasis on individual rights, on personal autonomy, on rational self-determination that characterizes modern liberal societies. These are partly Kantian inheritances. We've absorbed them so thoroughly, we don't recognize the philosophy underneath. When people insist on being treated with respect, on having their choices honored, on being recognized as equals regardless of background, they're asserting Kantian principles, whether they know it or not. The categorical imperative has become common sense in liberal democracies, at least as an aspiration, if not always in practice. Of course, criticisms exist. Kantian ethics can seem rigid, inflexible. What if lying would save a life? Kant's answer that you must never lie even then strikes many as absurd. A theory that produces such counterintuitive results must be flawed. Bernard Williams famously attacked Kant for demanding too much impartiality, for requiring us to view our own projects and relationships from a detached universal standpoint that denies what makes us human. Our particular commitments, Williams argued, give life meaning. Kantian morality threatens to drain existence of everything we value. Others found his metaphysics untenable. If the thing in itself is truly unknowable, why posit it at all? The concept seems to undermine itself. Either we know something about it, in which case it's not really beyond experience, or we know nothing, in which case we have no grounds for asserting its existence. This was Fichte's criticism, and it launched German idealism in a direction Kant never intended. The feminist critique came later, but cut deep. Kant's ethics emphasize rationality, autonomy, impartiality. These sound universal, but arguably reflect masculine values. An ethics of care focused on relationships and particular attachments might offer a different and equally valid moral framework. Kant's own views on women were conventional for his time. He denied them full rational capacity. This undermines his claim to universal principles. Post-colonial thinkers noted that Kant, despite advocating universal human dignity, held racist views typical of 18th century Europe. His anthropological writings contain embarrassing passages about non-European peoples. The gap between his principles and his prejudices reveals the limits of Enlightenment universalism. Perhaps what he presented as universal was actually parochial, the values of European educated males dressed up as eternal truths. Pragmatists like William James found Kant's system too abstract, too divorced from lived experience. Philosophy should address concrete problems, help us navigate actual situations. Kant offered grand architectonic structures that satisfied the intellect but provided little practical guidance. His categorical imperative sounds impressive but often proves difficult to apply. Existentialists rejected the Kantian subject entirely. Sartre argued that there is no fixed human nature, no universal rational structure. We create ourselves through our choices. Authenticity means embracing this radical freedom, not submitting to abstract principles. Kant's moral law, from this perspective, is another form of bad faith, an attempt to escape the anxiety of freedom by pretending necessity. These criticisms have force. Kant was wrong about many things. His physics, superseded by relativity and quantum mechanics, his biology, ignorant of evolution, his geography, filled with errors and prejudices, his views on race and gender, indefensible. Yet the core insights survive. That knowledge requires both experience and rational structure. That morality must be grounded in something more than preference or utility. That human dignity deserves respect. That reason can guide action. These claims remain worth defending, even if Kant's particular formulations require revision. Philosophy advances through criticism and reconstruction. Each generation finds new problems in old systems, develops new solutions, creates new problems for the next generation to solve. Kant's achievement was establishing the terms of debate for everyone who came after. You might reject his conclusions, but you must still engage his questions. Contemporary Kantians reformulate his insights in modern terms. Christine Korsgaard defends a version of the categorical imperative grounded in the nature of rational agency. Thomas Nagel explores the tension between subjective and objective perspectives that Kant first identified. Honora O'Neill applies Kantian principles to practical ethics. John Rawls constructed his theory of justice on explicitly Kantian foundations. The transcendental method, asking what must be true for experience to be possible, remains philosophically fertile. Not because Kant's specific answers were all correct, but because the question itself opens productive lines of inquiry. What are the preconditions of knowledge, of morality, of scientific investigation, of political legitimacy? These remain live questions. His moral philosophy especially endures. The idea that persons have dignity, that we must respect autonomy, that morality involves more than calculating outcomes. These intuitions run deep in modern consciousness. Kantian ethics gives them philosophical articulation. Even those who reject the categorical imperative often accept its underlying motivation, the sense that some things are simply wrong regardless of consequences, that human beings deserve respect not because of their usefulness but because of what they are. The political applications have proven equally durable. Democratic peace theory, the empirical observation that democracies rarely fight each other, vindicates Kant's speculation in perpetual peace. Constitutional government, separation of powers, checks and balances. These mechanisms embody Kantian suspicion of unconstrained authority. Human rights discourse speaks Kantian language, even when practitioners haven't read the critiques. Legal theory absorbed his influence thoroughly. H.L.A. Hart's distinction between internal and external perspectives on law echoes Kantian themes. Ronald Dworkin's emphasis on principles rather than mere rules, on treating litigants with equal concern and respect, develops Kantian insights. The entire enterprise of legal philosophy, asking what makes law legitimate, what distinguishes legal obligation from mere power. These are Kantian questions. Bioethics discovered Kant when medicine raised new moral dilemmas. Is it permissible to use one person's organs to save 5 others? Kant's answer is clear. You cannot treat someone merely as a means. Each person's autonomy must be respected. Informed consent, patient rights, the prohibition on non-therapeutic experimentation. These principles have Kantian roots. Business ethics too deploys Kantian arguments. Stakeholder theory holds that corporations have obligations beyond profit maximization. They must respect employees, customers, communities as ends in themselves. This challenges purely consequentialist approaches that justify anything producing good outcomes. The Kantian alternative insists some actions are wrong even if profitable. Environmental ethics struggles with Kantian categories. If only rational beings have dignity, what about animals, ecosystems, future generations? Kant himself offered little guidance here. His anthropocentrism seems outdated. Yet extensions are possible? Perhaps sentient beings deserve moral consideration. Perhaps we have duties regarding nature, even if not to it. Kantian frameworks can adapt to new challenges. Technology ethics faces distinctly modern questions. Privacy rights in the digital age, algorithmic fairness, the moral status of artificial intelligence. These weren't Kant's concerns, but his principles apply. Respect for persons means respecting their data. Dignity requires transparency in automated decision-making. Creating artificial general intelligence would raise profound questions about moral status and rights. The cosmopolitan vision remains relevant as globalization accelerates. We face planetary problems, climate change, pandemics, nuclear risks that require coordinated global responses. Kant's Federation of Free States, his emphasis on international law, his belief that commerce could promote peace. These ideas speak to current challenges. Nationalism hasn't disappeared, but neither has the aspiration to universal human community that Kant articulated. His philosophy of history seems quaint now. The teleological assumption that history progresses toward enlightenment, that reason gradually triumphs over superstition, that humanity advances toward perpetual peace. The 20th century, with its world wars, genocides, and totalitarian nightmares, shattered such optimism. Progress isn't guaranteed. Reason can serve evil as easily as good. Yet abandoning hope entirely seems equally mistaken. Kant's qualified optimism, his belief that we should act as if progress is possible even without certainty, retains appeal. The moral law obligates us regardless of outcomes. We must do what's right whether or not history cooperates. This captures something important about ethical life. That duty persists even when success seems unlikely. The aesthetic theory has influenced art criticism and philosophy of art. The distinction between beauty and the sublime, between the agreeable and the beautiful, between genius and talent. These categories shaped romantic and modernist thinking about art. Clement Greenberg's formalism, the idea that each art form should explore its own distinctive medium, echoes Kantian themes. So does Theodor Adorno's insistence that autonomous art resists commodification. Music theory absorbed Kantian ideas about form and content. Eduard Hanslick argued that music's meaning lies in its formal relationships rather than emotional expression. This was Kantian aesthetics applied to composition. The idea that great art achieves purposiveness without purpose, that it exhibits freedom within constraint. These insights continue to inform debates about artistic value. Literary criticism likewise bears his mark. New criticism's emphasis on the text itself, on close reading independent of authorial intention or historical context, has Kantian undertones. The work of art as autonomous object demanding attention on its own terms. Structuralism and post-structuralism, despite rejecting Kant's metaphysics, engaged his categories. The subject-object relation, the role of linguistic structures in shaping experience, these remain central concerns. Kant's influence on German culture specifically was immense. Goethe corresponded with him. Schiller wrote essays explicating his aesthetics. Hölderlin and Novalis absorbed his philosophy into their poetry. The entire Romantic movement, despite often opposing Kantian rationalism, defined itself against his system. German idealism from Fichte through Hegel developed an explicit dialogue with the critical philosophy. The university reforms initiated by Wilhelm von Humboldt embodied Kantian educational ideals: knowledge for its own sake, freedom of teaching and learning, the unity of research and instruction. These principles shaped the modern research university. When American universities adopted the German model in the late 19th century, they imported Kantian values along with the institutional structures. Psychology's emergence as a science involved negotiating Kant's claims. He'd argued that psychology could never be truly scientific because inner experience cannot be measured with mathematical precision. The introspectionists tried to prove him wrong. The behaviorists agreed with his critique and abandoned consciousness altogether. Cognitive psychology returned to mental states, but used computational models rather than introspection. Each approach defined itself relative to Kantian boundaries. Anthropology faced similar challenges. Kant lectured on the subject for decades, though his sources were travellers' tales rather than fieldwork. Modern anthropology, emphasising cultural relativism and ethnographic method, rejected his armchair speculation. Yet the question he posed remains central. What's universal in human nature versus culturally variable? Are there cognitive structures shared across all cultures? These debates continue. Linguistics discovered that language might embody universal structures. Noam Chomsky argued for innate grammatical principles, a universal grammar underlying all human languages. This was Kantian in spirit, if not in detail. The idea that the mind contributes structure to experience, that we're not blank slates. Chomsky explicitly acknowledged the connection to rationalist philosophy. Logic underwent transformation in the 19th and 20th centuries. Frege, Russell, and others developed formal systems far more powerful than Aristotelian syllogisms. Kant had claimed that Aristotelian logic was complete and perfect, requiring no further development. He was spectacularly wrong. Yet his emphasis on the synthetic a priori, on judgments that are necessary but not merely definitional, anticipated problems that formal logic would confront. Gödel's incompleteness theorems revealed limits to formal systems. Kant's insight that some truths resist purely logical derivation proved prescient even if his specific claims were mistaken. Mathematics continues debating issues Kant raised. Are mathematical objects discovered or invented? Is mathematical knowledge a priori or empirical? Platonists argue that numbers exist independently. Formalists say mathematics is just symbol manipulation. Intuitionists claim mathematical truth requires constructive proof. Each position echoes older disputes that Kant engaged. The philosophy of time remains contentious. Is time real or ideal? Does it flow, or is that an illusion? McTaggart's argument that time is unreal, Einstein's relativistic physics, debates about the direction of time and the nature of change. All these discussions reference Kant's revolutionary claim that time is a form of intuition rather than a feature of things in themselves. Space too continues generating puzzles. Newton thought space was absolute. Leibniz argued it was relational. Kant proposed a transcendental alternative. Einstein's curved space-time transformed the debate, but didn't settle it. Quantum mechanics introduced new complications. Is space quantized? What happens at the Planck scale? These questions show that Kant's problem hasn't been solved, merely reformulated. His theory of categories, that the mind applies concepts to organize experience, anticipated contemporary cognitive science. We now know that perception involves top-down processing, that expectations shape what we see, that the brain actively constructs rather than passively receives. Kant lacked modern neuroscience, but his philosophical analysis proved remarkably prescient. Kant's ethics has proven equally influential and controversial. The categorical imperative remains a touchstone for moral philosophy, whether one agrees with it or not. Critics attack it from every angle. Consequentialists argue that outcomes matter more than intentions. Virtue ethicists say character trumps rules. Care ethicists emphasize relationships over abstract principles. Yet even these critics define their positions partly in opposition to Kant. His framework sets the terms of debate. Applied ethics constantly invokes Kantian concepts. Medical ethics debates informed consent, treating patients as ends rather than means. Business ethics discusses stakeholder respect versus shareholder primacy. Environmental ethics asks whether nature has intrinsic worth. Each discussion traces back to questions Kant formulated about dignity, autonomy, and rational agency. Human rights discourse draws heavily on Kantian foundations. The Universal Declaration speaks of inherent dignity and inalienable rights. This isn't empirical observation, it's moral commitment grounded in philosophical argument. When we say torture is always wrong, regardless of consequences, we're reasoning in Kantian terms. When we defend free speech or due process, we're protecting autonomy. Kant's political philosophy influenced liberal constitutionalism, the idea that government requires consent, that individual rights constrain majority rule, that law should be universal and impartial. These principles shaped modern democracies. The framers of the American Constitution didn't read Kant directly, but Enlightenment ideas he articulated permeated their thinking. His essay on perpetual peace outlined conditions for lasting international order: a federation of free states respecting sovereignty, republican government internally, cosmopolitan hospitality across borders. The League of Nations, the United Nations, the European Union all reflect this vision imperfectly. The project remains incomplete, but the inspiration is recognizably Kantian. Democratic peace theory claims democracies rarely fight each other. Empirical pattern or philosophical truth. Kant predicted it based on his understanding of republican government. When citizens bear the costs of war, they're less likely to wage it frivolously. The data seems to confirm his hypothesis, though correlations never proved causation. His aesthetics transformed how we think about art and beauty. The Romantic movement drew inspiration from the Third Critique. Artists claimed creative genius as a natural gift beyond rules. The sublime became a central aesthetic category. Art was elevated from craft to revelation. Modernist art pushed Kantian ideas further. Abstract expressionism insisted on autonomous art objects, works that don't represent but simply are. Conceptual art emphasized the idea over the execution. Performance art challenged the permanence of the art object. Each movement engaged with problems Kant identified about aesthetic judgment's special character. Literary criticism absorbed Kantian categories. The new critics championed autonomous texts, divorced from authorial intention or historical context. Structuralists sought universal patterns underlying all narratives. Post-structuralists deconstructed those universals. But even deconstruction operated within frameworks Kant established about the relationship between concept and intuition. Music theory uses Kantian vocabulary. We speak of musical autonomy, of pure instrumental music conveying meaning without words. Beethoven's late quartets supposedly transcend earthly concerns to touch the noumenal realm. This way of thinking about music as autonomous and sublime comes directly from Kant's aesthetics. Architecture debates function versus form, utility versus beauty. Should buildings serve practical needs or express artistic vision? Kant distinguished the agreeable from the beautiful from the sublime. A building can be all three, but the categories remain analytically distinct. Modernist architecture's emphasis on pure form echoes Kantian aesthetics, even when architects don't realize it. Film theory adopted Kantian frameworks. Is cinema an autonomous art form or derivative of theatre and literature? How does editing construct meaning? What's the relationship between image and concept? These questions replay debates from Kant's aesthetics about imagination, understanding, and judgment. Education theory constantly returns to Kantian themes. What's the purpose of education? Transmitting knowledge, developing character, fostering autonomy? Kant lectured on pedagogy, arguing education should cultivate rational independence. Students must learn to think for themselves, not merely memorize. This ideal shaped progressive education movements, though implementation varies wildly. The Enlightenment project itself remains contested partly because of Kant. Postmodern critics attack universal reason as disguised domination. Feminists note that Kant's supposedly universal subject was implicitly male. Post-colonial theorists reveal Eurocentrism in claims about rationality. These critiques are powerful and important, yet they still operate within terms Kant established. Can reason be universal, or is it always situated? Are there human capacities transcending culture, or is everything socially constructed? These debates continue because Kant made them central. Even those rejecting his answers must engage his questions. Feminist philosophy has complex relationship with Kant. His ethics emphasizes autonomy and dignity, which supports feminist goals. Yet his examples often assume male subjects. His remarks about women were conventionally sexist for his time. Contemporary feminists salvage the framework while rejecting the prejudices. Care ethics challenges Kantian emphasis on abstract principle versus concrete relationships, but still acknowledges the importance of respecting persons. Critical race theory examines how supposedly neutral principles mask structural inequality. Kant's universalism sounds good, but historically excluded non-Europeans from full rational personhood. His own writings contain racist passages reflecting Enlightenment prejudices. Modern Kantians argue the framework survives these failings. The categorical imperative, applied consistently, demands racial justice. Others say the contamination goes deeper, requiring fundamental reconstruction. Disability studies questions assumptions about rational agency. Kant grounded morality in rational autonomy. What about those with cognitive disabilities? Are they outside the moral community? Contemporary Kantians extend the framework emphasizing dignity beyond narrow rationality. But tensions remain between Kantian ideals and disability justice. Animal ethics debates whether Kant's framework can accommodate non-human animals. He thought animals lacked rational autonomy, thus had no direct moral status. We have duties regarding animals, but not to them. Contemporary philosophers argue this is arbitrary speciesism. Others claim Kantian ethics simply cannot extend beyond rational beings. The debate reveals both the power and limitations of the framework. Environmental ethics faces similar challenges. Does nature have intrinsic value or only instrumental worth? Kant's anthropocentrism seems outdated given ecological crisis. Yet some argue his ethics provides resources for environmental protection. Destroying nature harms future persons, violates duties to ourselves as rational beings embedded in nature. The interpretations multiply. Bioethics constantly invokes Kantian principles. Debates about genetic engineering, cloning, enhancement technologies all reference human dignity. What counts as treating persons as ends? Is selecting embryos for traits treating them as means? Is cognitive enhancement respecting autonomy or violating it? These questions have no easy answers, but Kantian vocabulary frames the discussion. Artificial intelligence raises unprecedented challenges. Can AI systems be moral agents? Do they deserve rights? Should we program them with Kantian ethics or consequentialist calculation? The categorical imperative seems designed for rational beings, but what defines rationality? If machines achieve consciousness or autonomy, do Kantian principles apply? Neuroscience discoveries complicate Kant's picture. We're learning how much of cognition happens unconsciously. Decisions occur before conscious awareness. Free will looks increasingly dubious. Does this undermine Kantian ethics, which assumes rational autonomy? Some say yes, the whole framework collapses. Others distinguish metaphysical freedom from practical autonomy. We act as if we're free even if determinism is true. His theory of space and time influences physics interpretations. Quantum mechanics seems to challenge classical notions of objective reality. Does the observer create reality through measurement? Is this vindication of Kant's idealism? Most physicists reject that interpretation, but some embrace it. The relationship between consciousness and physical reality remains mysterious. Cosmology probes questions Kant addressed. What happened before the Big Bang? Did time have a beginning? Kant argued these questions produce antinomies, contradictions arising when reason exceeds its limits. Modern cosmologists sometimes reach similar conclusions. The universe's origins may be fundamentally incomprehensible, not due to missing data, but conceptual impossibility. String theory and quantum gravity seek unified frameworks. The search echoes Kant's architectonic ambition to unify all knowledge under systematic principles. Whether such unification is possible remains unknown, but the drive to find it, the conviction that reality must be ultimately coherent, reflects rationalist assumptions Kant embodied. Philosophy of mind continues debating consciousness. The hard problem asks why there's subjective experience at all. Why aren't we zombies processing information without inner awareness? Kant distinguished phenomena from noumena, appearance from thing in itself. Consciousness might be the noumenal aspect of brain processes, forever beyond scientific explanation. Or that's mysticism obscuring solvable problems. The debates rage on. His moral psychology anticipated later developments. He distinguished rational motives from emotional ones, duty from inclination. Freud's structural model with superego, ego, and id echoes this. Modern moral psychology studies how reasoning interacts with emotion. Jonathan Haidt argues emotion comes first, reasoning rationalizes. Others defend reason's primacy. The framework remains Kantian even when conclusions differ. Social contract theory revived in 20th century, largely through John Rawls. His theory of justice as fairness explicitly builds on Kant. The original position, where parties choose principles behind a veil of ignorance, translates Kantian autonomy into political terms. Rawls aimed to show that Kantian ethics yields determinate principles of justice, not just formal procedures. Communitarians challenged Rawls, arguing identity is socially constituted, not freely chosen. Michael Sandel claimed the unencumbered self is a fiction. We're embedded in communities that shape our values. This criticism echoes Hegelian objections to Kant. The individual versus community debate continues. Deliberative democracy emphasizes rational discourse among citizens. Jürgen Habermas developed ideal speech situation where only force of better argument prevails. This Kantian vision of rational consensus through dialogue contrasts with models emphasizing power, interest bargaining, or mere preference aggregation. Whether such deliberation is possible or desirable remains contested. Game theory and rational choice models dominate social science. These assume individuals maximize utility rationally. Critics note humans are often irrational, emotional, bounded by cognitive limits. Behavioral economics documents systematic deviations from rational models, yet the rational actor remains the baseline for comparison. Kant's picture of rational agency still structures how we think about human behavior. His influence on German culture was immense. Kant became a national symbol, the Sage of Königsberg, embodying German intellectual achievement. This cultural appropriation sometimes distorted his ideas, but testified to their power. Streets, schools, institutions bore his name. His birthday was celebrated. He was claimed by competing political movements. The Nazis tried appropriating Kant for their ideology. This required grotesque distortion, given his cosmopolitanism and rationalism. But ideologies selectively interpret their sources. More recently, Kant's thought has been invoked by defenders of liberal democracy against authoritarian threats. His ideas remain contested territory. East Germany under communism had complicated relationship with Kant. Marxist philosophers critiqued his idealism, yet acknowledged his progressive politics. Kant's emphasis on freedom and dignity couldn't be entirely suppressed, even in totalitarian context. After reunification, Kant's legacy was reclaimed for democratic values. His hometown Königsberg became Kaliningrad after World War II. The German population was expelled, the city renamed. Soviet authorities demolished much of the old city, including the university. But Kant's tomb survived. Even Stalin's regime couldn't bring itself to destroy that. Now Russian scholars study Kant, claiming him as part of Kaliningrad's heritage. Philosophy transcends national boundaries. The global spread of Kant's ideas accelerated in 20th century. Japanese philosophers engaged deeply with German idealism. Latin American thinkers adapted Kant to local contexts. African philosophers debated whether Kantian universalism could accommodate indigenous traditions. Indian philosophers compared Kant to Vedanta. Chinese scholars translated the critiques amid debates about modernity and tradition. This global reception transformed Kant from European figure to world philosopher. His questions about knowledge, morality, and aesthetic experience proved relevant across cultures even when answers differed. The categorical imperative's formal character allowed diverse interpretations. Critics noted this flexibility masked Eurocentric assumptions, but defenders argued genuine universality requires such openness. Contemporary Kant scholarship is a massive industry. Complete editions of his works and correspondence fill dozens of volumes. Specialized journals publish thousands of articles. Conferences convene regularly. Interpretations multiply. Some emphasize the revolutionary aspects, others the conservative elements. Some stress epistemology, others ethics. Some read him as proto-phenomenologist, others as analytic philosopher avant la lettre. The Kant that emerges from all this scholarship is more complex than simplified textbook versions. He was not purely abstract thinker divorced from practical concerns. He engaged contemporary science, politics, anthropology. He was not humorless pedant but enjoyed company and conversation. He was not isolated provincial but cosmopolitan intellectual, aware of global developments. His limitations are acknowledged more honestly now. The racism and sexism in his work cannot be dismissed as merely incidental. His system's totalizing ambition reflects problematic Enlightenment hubris. His confidence in reason's power seems naive after 20th century catastrophes. These criticisms don't erase his importance, but contextualize it. What remains? Why does Kant still matter? Because he asked the right questions even when his answers proved inadequate. What can we know? What should we do? What may we hope? These questions define human existence. Every generation must answer them anew. Kant showed us how to think about them rigorously. His method matters as much as his conclusions. The critical philosophy teaches us to examine the conditions of possibility for our knowledge and values. Don't take anything for granted. Question assumptions. Distinguish what we can know from what we can only believe. Respect the limits of reason while exercising it fully within its proper sphere. This critical spirit is Kant's greatest legacy. Not specific doctrines, but an attitude, a way of approaching problems. It's the demand for autonomy, for thinking for yourself, rather than accepting authority blindly. Sapere aude, dare to know. That Enlightenment motto Kant championed remains relevant, perhaps more now than ever, when misinformation spreads instantly and critical thinking seems increasingly rare. The man who never left Königsberg changed how we think about everything, but his influence didn't stop with abstract philosophy. It shaped the world you inhabit today in ways you probably never realized. Walk into any courtroom where human rights are debated. The language used, the principles invoked, they carry Kantian DNA. You can't understand where we are without understanding how we got here. And you can't understand modern thought without understanding the man from Königsberg who never left home, but changed everything. The man who invented history died somewhere around 425 BC, probably in theory, possibly back in Athens. The sources disagree, which would have amused him. He spent his life collecting contradictory accounts, recording different versions, admitting uncertainty. Now his own ending is lost in the fog of incomplete evidence, but the work survived. That's what mattered. Within a generation, the Histories was recognized as essential. Not just a collection of stories, but a new way of thinking about the past. Herodotus had shown that you could investigate, question, weigh evidence, and arrive at understanding.